Alright, ball joint multi-mesh workflow. Now this is the first video on the practical side, so congratulations on surviving the actual theoretical side. And then to practice what you've learned in the theoretical side, we're going to start off with something very simple. So the first assignment is going to be this awesome looking ball joint that Adi created, and we're going to rig it together from scratch. Right? So let's first dissect it because we have it ready right here. So we got two models, and so the top and the bottom, and they look awesome. They're already merged together, so this one is very convenient for that, so it's going to be faster. And then we have the armature. So the armature itself is very, very, very simple. It's only two bones. All right. So we've got the arm bone that has absolutely no locks and that has absolutely no constraints. And then we have the second bone that has locks in the location, none in the rotation and septuaquaternion, and then scale locks. All right. So since it's a ball joint, we want a freedom of rotation because it's a ball joint. Now, of course, we could add limits, but there's no need to. The animator that would animate this should know that if the geometry goes through, then it looks odd, all right? So just because of that, you don't really need to add restrictions. You can, however, if you really want to, but there's really no point on something like this, right? So it's a very, very simple rig and should be easy as a first task. Let's put these shapes back on. And now let's take a look at the file that we are going to work with. If you open 14 ball joint underscore start.blend from the support files, you will be presented with this awesome looking ball joint that Adi created. Now, we do have a tidbit of cleanup to do. The reason why is simple. If you haven't noticed already, the pivot point or the center point of each of these objects are not exactly at the center of the world where the armature pivot point will actually be. Now, the issue with that is if we rig this and we rig it like that, it will actually work. But if you export it to an engine or to another 3D application, chances are the object will snap back at zeros because that's what it usually needs to be. All right. So, and if somebody by mistake actually select everything, including the object, and clear the location, this is what will happen. And then you'll have the bone of the rigs, and then you'll have some weird looking things going on. Right. So it's really important to actually clear the location, the rotation, and the scale of the object. So the pivot points of these objects match the one from the actual armature. Right? So to do that, go to Object, Apply, or use the shortcut key Control A, and then choose All Transform. And as you notice, both pivot of both object, both switch directly to where the 3D cursor is. So now, this model has been optimized, and we can start creating an armature. So let's go ahead and add an armature. All right, so we've got the first bone on place that we can't see. So in order to see it, we're going to go here where the armature panel is, and on the viewport display, we're going to switch it to in front. We will also switch this to B bones, simply because I like B bones. And then we're going to put the names and the axis on so it's easy to work with. All right, so let's tab into edit mode for the bones, right? And let's set the actual transform pivot point to active element. Now, what that does is it allows me to edit the object from its own origin, right? So this bone's origin is the base of the bone. So each base of the bone is its origin. So if I hit S to scale the bone, I can scale it down, right? So what I will want to do too is to make it skinnier, right? So to do that, press Control Alt and then S. So now we have a skinny bone in place. Now what we need is to have a fine placement for the bone. So we need that actual joint to be directly at the center of this sphere where this joint would actually rotate. So to do that, the easiest way, so let's quickly go to edit and turn off locked object mode so we can quickly go back from one object to another, even if it would be in pose mode. So if we press Control Tab to go in pose mode, we can switch from object to the bone. Otherwise, with this on, so if I put lock object mode back on, and I go to pose mode, I won't be able to select my mesh, right, as you can see. So it's really important when you're working with armature to uncheck that. All right, so how do we do that? So first, let's select the actual sphere or the model and enter edit mode. And we're going to put the see-through on, and we're going to switch to edge mode. All right, so since there are some details directly at the center where it would be, but the rest around it has been left untouched, to get the center of the sphere, we can simply press Alt and then select a row of edge, and then Shift Alt and select the row of edge right beneath it. All right, so that way we'll get the center. So how do we bring the 3D cursor there? We simply press Shift S, and then from there we choose cursor to select it. And as you can see now, the 3D cursor has snapped to the center of the selection, which is the center of the sphere. All right, so now if we tab out of there and go out of the see-through mode or X-ray mode, let's select the bone, tab into edit mode, select the tip of the bone, and then press Shift S, and then selection to cursor. So now we know that this joint is directly at the center of where it should be, so that way it will rotate from the appropriate spot where it needs to rotate from. And now from there, we can actually extrude another bone. And you would want that bone to be relatively the same length as the other joint that it has, in case it would have another joint and then another joint and so on and so forth. And so now let's extrude this by putting the extrude on and simply clicking on the little handle and then bring it about the size of the actual joint. All right, so that should be good enough. All right, so now if you tab out of there and go back into pose mode, we actually have our bones. So we could rename those because right now they're named bone and then bone.001. So to rename the bone, you select the bone, and you go to the actual bone panel, or you could actually expand this and double click and rename the bone here as well. Let's actually do that. So this should be the bone at the bottom because it's the parent. So we're going to rename this one arm. And then let's double click under the other one, which is this one. And let's rename this one forearm. All right, so we've got arm and forearm. So now we've got two joint, and as you can see, the name changed here. So we've got arm and forearm. All right, so we're technically ready to actually parent this onto the armature. So select the object, which has been cleared of location, rotation, and scale, and then shift select the actual bone in pose mode and press Ctrl P. Then from there, choose bone because we want to parent the object to the bone. And then do the same thing with the base. Shift select the bottom bone, press Ctrl P, and then select bone. Now we have a working rig. Right. So on this one, we could lock the scale as well as the location, right? So that way, even if you press G, you can actually rotate it. If you press S, it doesn't do nothing, but if you press R, you can still rotate it. And so it's a little bit easier for the animator that way. And because he won't have to, or he or she won't have to worry about, mistakenly scaling the joint and so on and so forth. Usually, you would also make your mesh unselectable. Since they're a parent, they'll appear under the 3 or under the armature. So to lock them, you simply click on those little locks. And if you don't have these, you simply click on that and put them on right here. Right? So now we can assign bone groups. So it's a little bit easier to actually see what does what, and also easier to select for the animator. So to do that, we need to actually go to the armature panel, and under bone groups, we need to create a group for each color. So we're going to add 2 groups. So we're going to have a group for the arm, and we're going to have a group for the forearm. Right? So we're going to assign the arm. So by selecting it and selecting the actual bone group and hit assign, and then we're going to assign the forearm to the forearm group by hitting assign. Now, this is the default color. So you will have the default color of the bones here. So to change that, we need to put a custom color set or a color set. So I'm going to leave that one as red, which is the forearm, and I'm going to put the selection at actual orange. I'm going to make it clearer. And then I'm going to click on this, and in HSV, if I bring the value up and the saturation all the way down, it gives me white. All right. So I've got red, orange, and white. Now, if I do the same thing for the arm and add a custom color set, we're going to make this one blue. As you can see now, the bone is blue. And then we're going to put the selection here on orange as well. So if we have multiple selection, we know it, and we're going to press the active to white. Okay. So now if I select this bone and then shift select that one, you'll notice that this one is orange because it's also selected. So it's a cue that it's selected. Okay. And same thing here. So you can clearly tell that it's selected. Otherwise, it's not highlighted in orange. Okay. All right, so that's that. And now let's actually finish this rig by simply assigning custom bone shapes. So to create custom bone shapes, it's always best to create a new collection and call it CBS for custom bone shapes. And then select an object. So that way you can jump out of the actual mode, that is the pose mode. And then from there, select the CBS folder and press Shift A, and then under mesh, go to circle. So now we have a circle there. Let's actually bring the vertice count down to something small. So we're going to put it at 6, for example. All right, from there, you can press Alt G so it snaps back to the center of the world. And we can rename this CBS for custom bone shape. We can leave it as circle. So low circle. It doesn't really matter how you name these as long as you know which ones are what. So I'm going to add another circle, but I'm going to make it 12. So it's a little more higher resolution, if you will. You can press Alt G as well. And again, I'm going to call this one CBS mid circle, I guess. It really doesn't matter. And then we need these to have a 90-degree rotation on the x-axis so they point to the same way as the bone. Bones always points in the y direction, as you can see right here. So because of that, if we use a custom bone shape, we need to make it point on the y-axis as well. So in Blender 2.8 Plus, we can actually edit both at the same time. So if you make sure to select everything by pressing A, press R and then X and then 90 on the numpad, and then you'll have your 90-degree rotation. Now from there, we simply select the bone and actually go to the bone panel under viewport display, and there we have custom object. Now from there, you can choose them from the drop down if you don't have too many objects, and that's why we call the CBS, so they're easy to find. So we're going to put the low circle at the bottom, and we can actually change the scale of that if we want. If you want the scrolling to be a little smoother, just hold Shift at the same time. So you'll have a smoother blending of that scale, right? So now we've got the root there. So let's do the same thing with the actual upper bone. So you can also use the picker. So we're going to use the higher res version, and then we're going to bring that down by holding Shift. Now I'd like this one to be a little higher, so it's pretty much intuitive as to which part you're selecting. So we're going to select it right here, tab into edit mode, and then press G and then Y, and then bring it up the positive Y axis. All right, so now it's easier to select. All right, so from there, you can hide the custom bone shapes, just like that, so they're not in the way. And we pretty much have a final rig. So let's go clean that up real quick. We're going to turn off the names, turn off the axis as well. All right, and then from there, we can also make sure that these two are unselectable, so that way you don't select them while you're trying to pose them for your animation. So now we've finalized the rig. So what we've done is first clear the transforms. All right, so to reset the transform, the location, rotation, and the scale. And then from there, we've created the armature. We've actually pinpointed the bone at the right place using the 3D cursor for precise placement. And then from there, we extruded the other bone. And then from there, we assigned names to the bone through both the actual outliner as well as the bone panel. And then from there, we also assign groups, so bone groups with a color set, so it's easier to select. So it's a color code, if you will. All right, and then after that, we've created and assigned custom bone shapes and logged the object. So now we have a final model ready to be animated. All right, so congratulations, now you've just finished your first rig.